display, it is in the main portion only, sir. That's for you only, your view.
Okay.
Your slide is only prominent.
Okay, okay, fine.
Okay.
So, yeah.
फोन करो Hello?
Yes.
नहीं आ रहा है क्या हुआ चले जाओ बैठ जाओ
Good morning, friends. Professor Parthsarthy from IIT Mumbai has joined us for today's session. I now request our colleague, Mr. Sambarna, to formally welcome and introduce the guest, please. Mr. Sambarna, please take over.
हाँ सम्माना जी
गुड मॉर्निंग
हाँ आपका ऑलरेडी कॉल कर दिया ना मुरली सर
गुड मॉर्निंग सर
Good morning. We are able to hear you.
I have a
Please
great
proceed.
honor to introduce Professor Parthsarthy today on webinar series lecture. So, Dr. Parthsarthy is India's Value Fund Chair Professor of Sociology at Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Bombay. He is also an Associate Faculty of Interdisciplinary Program in Climate Studies and the Center for Policy Studies at IIT Bombay. He has earlier worked or held visiting positions at a Gentram Modern Orient at the Australian National University, National University of Singapore and Gentram Modern Orient Berlin. He is the author of Collective Violence in the Provisional City and co-edited Women Self-Help Groups, Restructuring and Socio-Economic Development and Cleavage, Connection and Conflict in the Rural, Urban and Contemporary Asia. He has carried out the research project and published in the areas of urban studies, law and governance, gender and development, research ethics, climate studies, and disaster risk and vulnerability. He has been involved in teacher education and online education activities at IIT Bombay through several MHRD supportive programs for the last 20 years. Sir, I request you please carry out today's lecture. Please, Professor Dr. D. Parthsarthy, please.
Thank you for that introduction. I hope I'm audible to all of you.
Yes, sir. Very much audible.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So I'll begin then. So firstly, I would like to thank the KV Sangathan and especially the Zonal Institute for inviting me to give this talk. I've been invited to address some of the workshops earlier, and I've greatly enjoyed talking to the various KV Sangathan officials. And I hope what I have to share will be of use to all of you. These are, as we all know, very extraordinary and difficult times for all of us, but especially for young children and students. So, as in a previous presentation by Dr. Padma Sarangapani, which I also heard, she highlighted the very significant role of the Kendriya Vidyalayas in India as a public education system in providing education to a very diverse set of students in India, and its substantial success as a public education system. And as I've said earlier in one of the presentations to the KV officials also, one of the reasons why the KV system has been so successful is because they are very proactive in foreseeing different kinds of challenges and reflecting on them, carrying out discussions and workshops, and then developing solutions. So this set of workshops that I am part of, I see as that proactive tendency of the KV Sangatan to perceive the challenges that the education system has in view of the current pandemic and see what kind of options we have to address these challenges. So I am going to be presenting wearing my hat as a sociologist. As you must have seen from my introduction, I wear many different hats. My primary training has been in sociology. And what I'm going to share are some views which have been articulated by sociologists for over 100 years within the broad field of what is called the sociology of education. So one of the founding figures of sociology was the French philosopher and sociologist called Émile Durkheim, who talked about not just the significance of sociology of education, but about the very important link between education and social sciences in general. So as I will show in a couple of slides later, Émile Durkheim started his life as a school teacher and then went on to teach in a university. And he's regarded as one of the 3 or 4 very important figures in the development of sociology in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And for him, the role of education was to develop good citizens and to develop citizens to work towards the idea of a good society. So for him, teaching was a very important activity, and he was working at a time when France and all of Europe was going through a crisis. There were several conflicts, wars, revolutions, industrial disruptions, crime, and so on. So he felt that teachers have a very important role to play in developing citizens who will reflect and come up with ideas about how to sustain the idea of a good society. So what he said was very significant, because he was not just talking about his time. He said every epoch or every era comes up with new kinds of challenges, new kinds of problems. So the ideas that he propagated at that time are very important for addressing contemporary problems also. And I will also refer to some of our own contemporary educationists in India who say very similar things. And perhaps that can help us to think about how best we can address the challenges brought about by this COVID-19 pandemic. Let me start with a couple of sentences which I've taken from a recent newspaper article by Mr. Anurag Behar, who is the CEO of Azim Premji Foundation. And many of you may know that the Azim Premji Foundation has been involved in huge number of rural education projects, especially targeting girl children. In this particular article, he is critiquing the idea of online education, which is being promoted so strongly, but about which many of us also have significant reservations. So for him, education is fundamentally about social interactions between the child and the teacher, and also between different children. And he says that much of the current online technologies do not facilitate the kind of interaction that are really required for education to be a successful activity. Having said that, he is also saying that his criticism of online education is not generic. It's about the way in which we are thinking or promoting online education right now with specific kinds of technologies, the kind of pedagogies we practice, that there is a possibility of rethinking online education so that we can sustain the relationship between teacher and student like we do in the physical classroom. And therefore, he ends this article by saying that the urgent task is for schools to be open. So he is therefore making a distinction between schools and education, and he's saying that the physical space of a school and the activities that go on in this physical space are extremely important. And even if during this lockdown period or during COVID-19, if students don't learn much, if we don't teach much, that's okay. What is important is for this social interaction between children and teachers to happen. So this fundamental idea is something that I want to pick up, that we need to go beyond the narrow way in which we focus on online learning, purely focusing on content, technology, delivery, syllabus, but not on broader aspects of education. So Anurag Bihar is talking about the kind of suffering that we are seeing in society today because of COVID-19 and because of the lockdown, and is particularly talking about children, especially the children of migrant workers who we've all seen in the media, and the kind of suffering they're going through. Um, so, what is it about the physical space of a school which makes it imperative that it should be opened at the earliest? So, as a social space, there are many things that happen in a school. Children play, children get together and eat lunch or other snacks, children have fun, they perform experiments, they discuss, they form friendships. All of these are equally important for the education of a child, and these are especially more important in these times when children are isolated with their parents or within smaller nuclear families. But opening up schools immediately is not in our hands. So it is the government that has to take these decisions. But there is a lot of recent work which focus on disaster risk management, which also talk about psychological risks. And there is a lot of work talking about schools and children also. And this research also shows that education institutions must have the autonomy to make decisions about what is best for children, schools. And therefore, this autonomy or flexibility for teachers to decide how best to impart education in these times is one of the fundamental points that I want to focus on, and I'll also talk about that in more detail later. So this brings me to the theme of this webinar series, and the way in which I admit to relate my topic to the broad theme of this series, that is the possible options for schools in the present constraints brought about by COVID-19. So for this, we need to understand that schooling and education are not the same, but they are in fact interrelated social processes, and that both schooling and education have multiple objectives and goals for societies at different stages of their evolution. Now, some of these objectives are related to knowledge and skills, as we are all well aware, but we also have other objectives that shape an individual personality and make her or him capable of meeting society's needs, communicate effectively, get along with people different from oneself, and learn social, political, and cultural norms of behavior. So we know that schools are not the only institutions which contribute to the achievement of these objectives. There are other groups, other institutions like family, peer group, mass media, social media, and so on. But schools have a very special responsibility because teachers are formally trained. But we also know that schools are social spaces. And this is something that Dr. Padma Sarangapani mentioned also, that schools are social spaces that encompass diversity and inequality in the Indian context. And therefore, they offer unique opportunities for developing a socially responsible human being. So this becomes much more clearer when we look at the larger debates on what is the purpose of education, something that has been discussed not just by social scientists or educationists, but by all leaders and philosophers for hundreds of years. So if you look at the Panchatantra or the Aesop's fables or the Buddhist sutras or mythologies across different cultures, if you look at systems of education, whether it is in remote tribal communities or in international schools, we see that these debates about the purpose of education, they focus on one key aspect regarding the purpose of education, that it is not simply about short-term goals, but about long-term future objectives. That the purpose of education is not about delivery, but how to think of content, knowledge, pedagogy, curriculum, etc., in terms of long-term social goals. And so this crisis brought on by COVID-19 pandemic, while it does require immediate solutions to keep education as a social process ongoing, it also gives us an opportunity to think about the future and what is our role as teachers in rethinking the purpose of education. So we know that among the different kind of responses to COVID-19, there is also misinformation. Some people even deny, and not just in India, that it is a serious crisis. Some people deny that the lockdown has effects, adverse effects on some communities, especially migrant workers. There is a lack of empathy. There is profiteering happening by some companies. There is an inability to properly plan the consequences. For example, I've written a paper recently which show that disaster management guidelines prepared in 2010 to deal with this kind of pandemic have not been implemented at all. So these are indicators not just of governance failure, but of a larger educational failure as well. So it is not only important to think about how, it is not only important to discuss about how we think about the purpose of education, but how not to think about it also. And this is what Anurag Behar, the CEO of Azim Premji Foundation, whom I cited earlier, was trying to say. So how do we think about what are our priorities? When we ask questions about what are the possible options for us given the present constraints, what are our priorities? So we know that children will be worried about their own health and that of their family members. I myself have lost several relatives during this time, and I could not, go and visit those family members. We are reading about social suffering and health. We're reading about the traumas that people are occupied with. Children may also have trauma about the future, especially those in the secondary schools. Parents are losing jobs or working on reduced salaries. So we, as teachers, as part of our options, need to think about how we can go beyond the curriculum and address these other needs of children. So for that, we need to understand that schooling is a subset of education. That is, education is more than knowledge. Education is about uh, inculcating culture in its broadest sense. But here it doesn't mean that we perpetuate the existing society. All the works in sociology of education over the last 100 years say that the perpetuation of society means that we also train students or children to adapt to change, to reduce conflicts, to ensure fairness, justice, equity, how to adapt to changing external environments, including climate change and so on. So this will require that we as teachers develop children's abilities related to curiosity, creativity. Otherwise, these children, when they grow up, will fail to lead change effectively. And if children have to grow up and contribute to change, then we must encourage these curiosity, creativity, and so on. And this we already see in the name of some of the famous child activists that we know of today, like Greta Thunberg in the area of climate change, and Malala Yousafzai in the area of child rights and educational rights. So the purpose of education then is to train children to think about the crisis that societies face, to ensure that they are not adversely affected psychologically by this, and to also enable them to find solutions towards this in the future when we are no longer there. And therefore, this has resulted in a number of scholars and educationists thinking about this idea of schools as humanizing spaces. That is, humanizing the school, humanizing technologies like technologies we use for online education, humanizing the classroom, and so on. So here again, I would like to go back to what Dr. Padma Sarangapani was talking about earlier, about the issue of inequality that is so very persistent in Indian society. So There are a number of ongoing efforts to look at school and education as part of our efforts to humanize ourselves. That means we cannot get caught up too narrowly in discussions of curriculum or pedagogy when it comes to online teaching. But we have to reflect on these in terms of the larger humanizing objective of schools and education systems. So here, the work of the British sociologist of education, Basil Bernstein, is very important because he looked at something called education codes, which he borrows from linguistics, language codes. So the way we talk, he says, um, the way language is used by different communities, whether it is groups of boys or men or women, people belonging to particular racial groups or castes or ethnicities or religious groups, these sometimes unconsciously influence our ideas of what is pedagogy, what is a good assessment system, what is education, and so on, what is skill, what is talent. So, just to give you a small example, and I'll elaborate it in the next slide. Uh, Certain students may not be very good at writing uh, in good dramatic fashion, but they may have very interesting ideas. They may be very good at throwing up, at contributing to discussions orally or in written format. Now, which one is more important? So some people, because of the family background of the schools they have been to, may have very good writing capability or ability to argue in English. Other people may not have the language ability, but may have the ability to think. Some other students may have very good mathematical abilities. So it is important for us to recognize that different kinds of groups use language communication in different ways and value all of these. Otherwise, there is a danger that this kind of communication will convert into education code, and I'm going to elaborate on this in the next slide, and they can perpetuate inequalities. Whereas the objective of education is to create aspirations, help students overcome the constraints from family or poverty or inequality and so on. So, using examples of everyday conversation, uh, Basil Bernstein talks about how in communication we use different kinds of codes which perpetuate social inequalities. I've given you this picture of this recent movie called Jojo Rabbit, which is around which is based in Nazi Germany in the 1940s during the Second World War. And I don't know how many of you have seen it, but I advise all of you to see it, especially see it with your children or students. So it talks about certain kinds of misconceptions, the way in which the Germans talk about Jews and showing Jews to be monsters with horns, and they're very dirty people, very greedy people, and so on. So generalizing, stereotyping about a particular community is part of everyday language and communication for Germans, and this was inculcated in children as part of the education system itself at that point of time. Okay, and how actual physical interaction between one German boy and a Jewish girl helps them to overcome these stereotypes. So that is exactly what we're talking about here, and we see that in very different contexts also. In India, boys may talk in a stereotyped way about girls, for example, or sometimes the reverse also. So there are various kinds of assumptions that children or students may have about other groups. In the absence of the physical space of a school, it is possible that within their own family locations, uh, these stereotypes or these assumptions may perpetuate and sustain. This is the reason why the physical space of a school is so very important, because in a school, children from all kinds of backgrounds come together and we are able to learn more about each other, and we are able to break down these codes of language which are specific to particular social groups. And that itself helps teachers to value different forms of communication differently. For example, in one of my own classes, there was a student uh, who was excellent in discussing all kinds of topics in the classroom. He also had very good statistical abilities, but his exam papers used to be blank until we did a psychological test to find out that he had a particular kind of disability which prevented him from writing. So uh, whether it is disability, whether it is religious group, whether it is gender, they all have different kinds of abilities. And in a school, We have to overcome these specific kinds of disabilities in communication brought on by the group they belong to, and that can happen if there is more communication across. When it comes to online teaching, then how do we address this? Because in a physical classroom, the teacher always is alert to these kinds of differences, and we can find out how to help students with different kinds of abilities. But in an online mode, the scope for actually observing students, assessing them, finding out which student has what kind of need is very limited. So this idea of Basil Bernstein about education codes offers one very important entry point for us to see what kind of problems may exist when it comes to online teaching and learning. Um, is there any question or comment immediately, or can I continue?
Good morning, sir.
Any urgent question, I can take it. Otherwise, we can take them in the end.
Good morning, sir. Sir, the slides are not visible, sir. We cannot see the slides.
Oh. None of you can see the slides?
No, slides are visible to us. Maybe they have to look into their setting. We are able to see the slides. There are no
sir.
issues about it.
Okay, sir.
Okay. So let me continue then. So, So in order to ensure that education codes unconsciously do not become part of our pedagogy and assessment systems, especially in online education, we always need to keep in mind the purpose, the objectives, and outcomes of education, both for individuals and for society. And here I would like to specify 5 broad outcomes or objectives that are important for all societies, but especially for India, where we still have large social inequalities and deprivation. The first and most obvious, of course, is social mobility. In societies around the world, education is the most important factor that affects an individual's ability to move up in the social ladder by getting better opportunities, better jobs, better skills, and so on. In an earlier talk that I had given at the KV Sangatan in Bhandup, I also spoke about Mahatma Gandhi's 3 pillars of Nai Talim, that education always, we must remember, has a lifelong character. It's not something that is restricted to school or a college, but it has a social character. That is, that education is not just for an individual, but it is something to develop an individual to contribute to society, and that it is a holistic process. Holistic in 2 senses. One, that does not happen only in school, happens in family, happens in many other institutions. And secondly, it is holistic in the sense it's not just about content or skills, it's also about acquiring civic sense, about social norms, tolerance, about values, morals, uh, knowledge about one's own society, and so on. But beyond this, there is also interesting ideas about uh, how education can contribute to well-being. So the term that I've given there, Eudaimonia, is a term that was first used more than 2,000 years ago by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. More recently, the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum has written about it. And in her definition, education is not something that is important only for one's own well-being. It is fundamental for what she calls as human flourishing. That is, the concept of eudaimonia refers to something that includes well-being. It includes having enough to meet your basic needs, able to address any challenges like the one we are facing now without too many losses and suffering, able to adapt to challenges like climate change, and also most importantly, happiness. So we are not just concerned with meeting our basic needs, but human society or human civilization has to flourish. And for that, education is seen as being imperative. And this also, Martha Nussbaum draws from the work of Amartya Sen, who says that education, along with freedom and health, these 3 things help us to function well in society. And they're also part of what is called as capabilities. So if we have education, on the one hand, it helps us to find good jobs. On the other, it also has an intrinsic importance in that it gives us self-respect, which is also important for well-being. And then the French sociologist of education, Pierre Bourdieu, his contribution to the sociology of education has been one of the most important in the last 40 years or so. So he talks about how education is important for acquisition of social and cultural capital. And this is especially an issue when it comes to online teaching, because social capital refers to not what we know, but who we know. So we develop friendships, and these friendships can extend beyond school once students graduate from school also. So we learn from each other, we learn aspirations, we learn about social goals, we learn about what is the right way of achieving our objectives, we learn about which kind of careers or career options are available. And later on, we may use these networks for various kinds of benefits. The second kind of capital that Bourdieu refers to is cultural capital, which is not just knowledge. Knowledge is one of it, one aspect of it. It also includes communication, the development of the personality. Cultural capital refers to uh, the ability to think critically and creatively, the ability to adapt yourself to changes in the job market, or if there is a sudden crisis in the economy, if you want to do something new, the ability to learn something new. So all of these are acquired not just from the teacher, but in the physical space of a school, through friends, through libraries, through in the playground, through extracurricular activities, and so on. And that is another reason why the physical space of a school is very important, and we need to think about how we can replicate this when it comes to online education. So I'll take another 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. So I mentioned at the beginning of my talk the work of Emily Durkheim, who's regarded as one of the founding figures of sociology and the sociology of education. So one of his famous books is on moral education, and I want to specify right at the outset that his idea of moral education is very different from moral science, because for him the moral aspect is to do with what we can do for society. How do we develop, how do we work for a good society where there are less conflicts, where there is less inequality, less injustice, less exploitation, and everybody is able to help each other using their different talents and skills. That is his idea of a moral education, to develop good citizens. So, as I said earlier, he started out as a school teacher, then became a university professor, and his contributions to sociology and philosophy especially is very well known. So one of the questions he asks is, how can school and education create the conditions for a good society? And what is a good society? A good society is where we have a particular idea of a certain human ideal. In fact, if you read his work, he replaces God with the human being. He said we should treat every human being as God, because what is the ideal human being who doesn't exploit, who doesn't discriminate, who tries to help others? How do we develop this ideal of a person, and what is the role of a school or education in that? And he says that one of the unique things about schools is that it helps an individual being to become a social being. That is how we develop relationships. And this is one of the key things that is very difficult to do in online education, because relationships automatically happen in a physical space of a school when you are next to each other, when you're in the physical presence of other children and of teachers. How do you do this in online education? I'll come back to that in a little while. So socialization is an important aspect of education, and it's not just about content, but also how to fit into society. But also, more importantly, if there are certain things wrong with society, how do you take that as a challenge so that you address those problems? So he says that it is not just about continuing an existing society, because that can perpetuate inequalities, but there are emerging needs. So we can think of the COVID-19 lockdown, etc., as emerging needs. So if I, as a teacher, am offering online education to students, how do I identify what these emerging needs of children are in this kind of a crisis situation, and how do I address that? What kind of a pedagogy do I follow? That is, what kind of teaching methods should I follow? Is it just a matter of having Zoom or Skype or whatever and preparing slides and teaching them, or do I have to think of teaching in a very different way? Okay, and especially one of the key aspects that Durkheim mentions as an important role of the teacher in education is how do you inculcate respect for the human being, for other human beings. And he says this can be done if we better understand child psychology and the importance of understand the importance of communication between children. So in online education, especially, it's very important that we think about facilitating more interaction between children. So how to replicate the classroom so that they have informal conversations, they exchange gossip. Sometimes even when the teacher is talking, they're talking. Those things are also an important part of the whole process of education. So understanding what happens in the communication between children and facilitating that, maybe through other various kinds of discussion groups online, is an important part of education itself. Because one of the things that Durkheim says is that as social beings, we enjoy being in the company of others. Collective life is pleasant. He says it's a pleasure to say we rather than say I. So, but unfortunately, we also grow up in a society where society teaches you to privilege the I in you, not the we. And that is why we see that even when we see other people suffering, some people deny it, or some people don't fail to empathize. So what must we do as teachers to enable the child to savor this pleasure of saying that I'm part of a we? What is the role of the teacher in achieving this? And he says the teacher can do this effectively only if he or she has autonomy. So this is where he says that it is very important that teachers and teachers associations have more power than, say, a government agency to decide what is best, what kind of strategy, what kind of pedagogy, what kind of teaching methods are more effective in enabling this kind of collective life to happen, in enabling children to acquire this ability to think of we. And that will lead to good citizens. That's what he says. So you can see here a snapshot of what Durkheim is saying, that the role of education is to create social solidarity. It's not just about individual benefit, but how to fit into society, how to contribute to society. And here especially is talking about the role of history as a subject, how it can help facilitate this solidarity, but also civics, how citizenship takes this even further by talking about the duties and responsibilities of an individual to society. And therefore, from this perspective, school is nothing but a society in miniature. And if school is nothing but society in miniature, this cannot be replicated in an online education system. Okay? We need to do much more than just put up recordings or teach online through videos, or put up material and ask them to read and get back to us and clarify doubts. It has to be something much. I come to an Indian sociologist of education, Krishna Kumar, whom many of you may be knowing. He was the director of the Central Institute of Education in Delhi and also of the NCERT, and he played a very important role in development of the national curriculum framework. And what Durkheim said more than 100 years ago is something that Krishna Kumar talked about in this article, which is about 30 years old, but in some of his recent work also, he keeps emphasizing this. So in this particular article, which I've already shared with you, he talks about this idea of what is worthwhile education. So this is a question that we must ask, whether the education is taking place in the physical space of a school or in online format. So the idea of a worthwhile education is not simply to borrow or follow that somebody in Yale or Harvard or Cambridge is doing this, somebody in America is following this method, therefore we must do it. That's not how we think about it. So what are the current conditions in society and culture? What is worthy of being taught in this particular context of a pandemic or a lockdown? Okay, so, but then this question can be posed easily. It is very difficult to answer it. How do we determine what is worthy of being taught? How do you put a value on what type of knowledge is worthwhile in an education transaction between students and children? So to this, he offers two ways of understanding this. One, he says you can understand what is worthy of being taught by looking at it from the point of view of the learner, that is the child. So he says it is not easy. Some teachers acquire this special ability to understand the child's point of view. Some of us do it very well, some of us not so very well. So this is something that we have to inculcate. And this is even more difficult to do if the child is not in your physical presence. So we have to spend much more time, maybe in the first few classes, trying to understand what the child is going through during this crisis, so that we can then develop a pedagogy of teaching children in the online mode. The second way of deciding what is worth teaching is to think about the intrinsic value of what we wish to teach. And for this, Krishna Kumar advocates a particular method which he calls as curriculum deliberation, which is related to what I was talking about earlier about Durkheim's idea of autonomy, that teachers have to come together. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please
There
go
was a
ahead.
disturbance. Yeah, sorry. There was a disturbance. So he says that there has to be curriculum cannot be fixed for all time. Neither can it be borrowed, or it can come from government or some authority. So teachers have to constantly discuss among themselves, deliberate about what kind of curriculum is more effective in different kinds of changing contexts. And for this to happen effectively, we must be careful not to dissociate between the curriculum and the child's immediate socio-cultural milieu, which means that the child is now in this particular situation located in a socio-cultural milieu, which may be within a family setting, which may be somewhere away from the family also, because the child may be in lockdown conditions. What kind of family the child belongs to, what kind of locality the child lives in, which community socio-economic does the child come from. Understanding that is very important for us to reframe the curriculum or modify it so that it relates to what the child is going through at this particular point of time when the child is not in the physical space of the school. This means that when it comes to education in general, but specifically with reference to online education, our perception as teachers of what kind of society and people we are, what kind of society we want to be, has to go into our teaching methods. So we have to ask these questions. What is worth teaching in this particular point of time? So maybe certain things are not very important, even though it may be part of the syllabus. Certain other things which are important from the perspective of the child has to be focused on more. The question of how the pedagogy has to be given importance. If do all children have the same facilities for receiving online education is something we have to assess. How are opportunities for education distributed? So when it comes to online education, the technology, the facilities, even something like internet access or electricity, all of these may not be equally distributed. So assessment of all this will make us design our pedagogy and curriculum in a very different way to address the different needs of children. So I'm going to conclude now by talking, so drawing from these different ideas that we have from sociology of education, what is it that we can do and what is it that we cannot do in the present circumstances? So going back to the main theme of this webinar series. Firstly, we must never lose sight of the modern idea and ideal of a school, that it is about a social space in which children from different backgrounds come together, that there is a broader idea of education which goes beyond just content and knowledge. It is about socialization, it is about creating opportunities, it is about inculcating curiosity and creativity and so on. Now, it is obviously very difficult to replicate the physical space of the school environment in the online format. But still, we can try. And here, I would like to point to certain, I'm not going to give you actual suggestions. These are things that teachers have to work out for themselves and with the help of the principals and other officials. These are issues which need to be considered when we talk about what more can we do with online education. One, so Ratish Kumar is a former PhD student of mine. He is now a faculty at JNU in Delhi. He did a very interesting study of the difference between what happens formally and what happens informally in schools after education reforms were implemented in Kerala. So this includes things like extracurricular activities or library periods or playgrounds or even reading online, informal peer-to-peer interaction, what happens between classes when the teacher is not there and students talk to each other. And he found that a lot of learning happens through these informal interactions also, not just in a formal way. So trying to give more space to children to interact informally in the presence of a teacher or in the absence of a teacher is something that we have to think about. Um, Play obviously is very important for children. So we know that children already are very clued in into playing all kinds of games online. Not all children have access to this, of course. But again, finding out more about our students, finding out about where they live, maybe forming smaller groups so that they can play in physical space or online, or maybe even in while a class is going on, introducing certain kind of games. That is another way in which we can recreate the or replicate the school environment. Having more opportunities for questions and discussions uh, within this online format. Uh, Having more group activities, also forming smaller groups of classes and giving them group activities which they can do outside of the actual hours fixed for the teaching, and then they can come and present it. Making sure that friendship groups are not broken up during this lockdown period. So finding interesting ways. Otherwise, we also find that they get into what is called as a dark web. So it's very important that more positive interactions take place among friends. And again, teachers can play a very important role. Schools can play a very important role in facilitating this. Having more online extracurricular activities, whether it's arts or other kinds of activities. One of the things that's especially very difficult is teacher availability to students. As teachers, we also have, many of us have children, and during the lockdown, we have to address their needs also. But it's very important that teachers are available to students beyond the specific hours when you're teaching. So some students may want to talk to you, may want to clarify doubts, may want to talk about their career needs, psychosocial needs beyond hours. So making yourself available is very important, because we all know as teachers that students tend to catch hold of us in the corridor. They tend to want to talk to us about various things outside the classroom. That opportunity has to be made available also. And finally, the connection towards nature, because we are already seeing very interesting examples of how nature is expressing itself during this lockdown, whether it is reducing pollution, animals coming out onto the streets. Um, uh, Nature is trying to use this opportunity to regenerate itself. So one way of having more empathy towards others in the environment around us is by having more empathy towards nature. So this is also not very easy, but thinking of various activities through which children can do activities related to the environment or nature and then bringing it back to class is something that is seen to be de-stressing for a lot of children. So I would like to conclude by using this slide from an NGO called Vikalp Sangam, which tries to reinterpret Gandhi's idea of Nai Talim. So they want to talk about developing communities which are sustainable, which are non-exploitative, and which don't necessarily have to migrate for work, but which can find self-sustaining activities in wherever they are living, but which are also equitable, happy, creating. This is the idea of Eudaimonia that I mentioned earlier, which is happy and creative and sharing and just. So if this is the ideal of education in a physical, social space of a school, can we think of innovative ways to replicate this in online education? Those are the options that we need to think of. I'll stop here. Thank you very much again for the opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Now, any of the participants, if you want to interact with him, you are most welcome now.
Good morning, sir. I am D.K. Dwivedi from Lucknow. Very nicely, sir, you spelled out everything, the journey beyond curriculum, and how school physical space is so very important for the child where he is so emotionally attached with. Here, sir, one more dimension what we are struggling with to handle, and I would definitely like you to throw some light on that and enlighten us. One more challenge in conduct of these online classes during this pandemic. The teacher connect with the child, that particular issue. There are situations, especially when the child is switching over from primary to upper primary. I'm just citing an example. This is likely to happen if this situation continues for more than either 2-3 months or 6 months in class 10 to 11 as well. But at present, we are facing, sir, this problem that when the child of primary class 5, who is of approx 10-year age, and is not having any kind of physical interaction with the teacher of class 6, who is entirely a new teacher, and even the teacher does not have any kind of input about the entry behavior of the child or exit behavior of class 5. And in the online class, when I am handing over that lot of the children to this kind of the lot of the teacher who doesn't have any kind of association because he is coming from primary to upper primary, and absolutely no connect, and absolutely because there is a lot of compartmentalization in every system where primary children and primary teachers are handling that lot only. So in this situation, sir, when the child comes to online mode and teacher is handling this lot, that is he has never interacted with, he doesn't even know the likes and dislikes of the child. Can you, sir, tell us some ways and means how to address this complicated issue, sir?
Thank you. Maybe I'll take a couple of other comments and then I can answer them together.
Good morning, sir. So by this inputs, it is very clear we have a lot of challenges. After listening to you, now we got exact what is the problem. The problem of teaching online classes. So this will give us some more insightfulness, and we can work how we can achieve the objectives of education. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, good afternoon, sir. I am Subramaniam from Ranchi region. Sir, actually, we plan and organize the online classes as a temporary measure. And in that, while organizing, as you said, how to bring all the such factors that are available in the school and the classroom, that every teacher is trying. But when I contacted with some students studying abroad, maybe in universities, schools I don't have any contact, but in universities, there what and all you have said, it is being achieved. The children are not finding anything different in studying online or offline. Some of the classes, half of the classes they are attending offline, and many classes they are attending online. They say that there is no difference. But here, we ourselves have a feeling that one is better. Offline is always better. Online cannot be substituted. Is it a myth, sir, or do we have to adopt a new or some changes to be done to achieve that state? Our children also should feel that whether it is online class or offline class, there is no difference.
Yeah. Thank you. Maybe I can take these three.
Sir, good afternoon, sir.
Okay.
Good afternoon, sir. This is from Chandigarh region. The question is, we talk a lot about online teaching and off teaching. In this present COVID-19 situation, we have a syllabus, and teachers are not given a full autonomy, and the teachers are not able to reach the students also. So in this case, what would you advise the Kendriya Vidyalaya Sangathan to do? Because we have a prescribed syllabus and we don't have sufficient time also. So when we talk about the autonomy of the teachers and the syllabus, can you give some suggestion to Kendra Vidyalaya Sangathan so that the teachers given some autonomy and basic certain concepts are to be taught in the classes without taking much of their time online? Thank you.
Thank you. So shall I take these four and then we'll see if we have time? We
Yes,
can come
sir.
back. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Thank
Please
you.
go ahead.
So thank you very much for that feedback. And I'm sure that you all have much more experience in these issues than me. But I am sharing what I know. My experience has been with mostly teaching college teachers and school teachers. And online education has been mostly at the university level. But from a broad sociology of education perspective, which is one of my specializations, I've tried to share. Mr. Trivedi's question about teaching connect with the child going from primary to secondary, that's an extremely important aspect. And this is important whether we're talking about online or offline, but it's particularly aggravates in the context of online teaching. So I only have one suggestion which you can think of, and this is something that I've seen from the work of a lot of NGOs like Pratham in Mumbai and other kind of NGOs which are working with children who drop out of schools and who also have similar kind of issues. So they organize something called bridge courses, which can be few days, few weeks, for children who are moving from one stage to another. So one way is to have some kind of a bridge course, which can even be for a few hours or for a few days, where the teachers of both classes can come together, initially talk to each other also about these children, but also sit together with these children to understand their needs as they go from the primary to secondary. We must remember that it's not simply going from primary to secondary, but that particular age is very important because there are also physiological changes happening to boys and girls as they go through puberty. There are also cognitive development that is happening to their brains at that particular point of time. So it's a very crucial period when it is important that we do a lot of hand-holding with the children so that they don't get lost. So the point that you raise is extremely important, and I would suggest some kind of bridge programs involving teachers and students to some kind of informal training programs, not training programs, sorry, informal workshops to better understand the needs of these children. And I can probably inquire with some of my friends working in this area and see if they have some specific programs in this to address this. Second, the objectives of education. The official from Jabalpur, I didn't get his name. I'm sorry. Thank you for that comment. In fact, that is the primary emphasis for me. So we have to always keep at the back of our mind what is the purpose of education before we get into thinking about the best options, whether it is technological or non-technological or something else. What is the overall purpose of education? What am I here for as a teacher? Okay, and that is what should inform our strategies. Mr. Subramaniam, thank you for your question. Um, you're very right about the difference between universities and schools, and we ourselves are observing it. So my talk was primarily addressed for school education because university education is very different. There has been a lot of discussion on the differences in online education between higher education and schools. And at the level of higher education, we are primarily offering certain sets of skills, higher level of skills, concepts, techniques, and these are things which can be acquired to some extent online as well. And we are not addressing the other objectives of of socialization and so on that much in higher education. So that is the reason I emphasize the multiple objectives of education in schools, because as we go to the higher education levels, we narrow down on the objectives of education. So in schools, challenge is tougher because we have these multiple objectives. And therefore, uh, uh, it is impossible to do away with the social space of a school. At the same time, during this kind of a crisis, in the short term period, hopefully it will be short term, we need to think about how we can leverage technology to replicate some of the aspects of the social space of school in the online space. The last question about autonomy, I will leave it to Mr. Murali to think about this. I'm not the right person, but I would just like to say that it's very important. Okay, I'll use our example of IIT Bombay because as an MHRD institution created by an act of parliament, we have autonomy. And so the kind of questions that you raise about covering syllabus, whether all concepts can be taught, suppose they don't learn certain concepts, will they find it difficult when they go to the next class? These are things that apply to us also. Right? So we have used our autonomy, had several rounds of discussion both within each IIT as well as across IITs to the IIT Council, and come up with various methods. So sometimes we have given extra classes without marks also, so that students are not stressed out, but they acquire the basic concepts required, which they're going to use in the next year. So autonomy is never given to any of us. Okay, we have to ask for it, we have to demand it, we have to take it. So I think this is a nice moment when the MHRD and the ministers, at least in their public statements, they are saying that we are open to change, that we are open to flexibility and autonomy. So an argument has to be made formally by the teachers of KV and the KV Sangatan, saying that this kind of autonomy is required to address these challenges in this sphere, and I'm sure it will be given. We also were skeptical, but as we started making these demands on MHRD, and we did get this flexibility. So that flexibility has to come through teachers' associations.
So good morning, I'm from Ernakulam region. It's not a question. Actually, I wanted to add one point. You rightly said the bridge course between the transition period from primary to secondary and secondary to higher secondary. Actually, the problem is very serious in primary to secondary because higher class children, they may be able to adapt immediately. What we have done in our region is that one day in a particular school, we felt that there is a need for interaction. On a platform medium only, all students along with the primary teachers and secondary teachers came together. So they discussed non-academic issues, and what we got the feedback is that it was very much useful for the children. They feel that primary, the transition, they could adapt to the new classes. And we feel that it will be very much useful. As you said, there is no doubt the bridge between the primary and secondary is very much important. I think all schools, we should conduct that on a particular day. Non-academic issues can be discussed with the primary teachers and the secondary teachers. So it will be very much useful to adapt to the new situation, new type of teachers, new type of academic activities in the schools. That will I want to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Kerala has always been a leader in education, so I'm happy to see this.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, sir. This is S.V. Joglekar calling from Tinsukia region. In fact, sir, I was fortunate to attend your live session also at ZIET Mumbai in the first week of March this year. And once again, through Life Size app, and especially through this video conference, again, I'm fortunate to listen to you, sir. Sir, talking in terms of online class, what I would like to place here on record, based on the experiences we have received over the last few months prior to summer vacation, core objectives of any education system is always, we talk about making the teacher to play the role of facilitator. This is on one hand. And on the other hand, we always talk about to give sufficient amount of space for each child to think critically and to think creatively, leading to make him an independent. That is what generally the core objectives of any education system is all about. Sir, when I use the word talking in terms of online class, to a certain extent, I don't mean to say to a greater extent, to a certain extent, these two core objectives of education system has been fulfilled to some extent. Say, for example, now no longer a child is purely dependent on a teacher. This is one thing. Second thing is that the child has got enough space to think separately, to think critically, and to come out something in a very creative manner.
Region, please ask question. Nah, don't teach us. You ask question to the Dr. Parthsarthy sir. Please ask question.
Okay, thank you, sir. So the sir question is, we are able to achieve this goal to some extent. Now the problem is there are other number of students whom we could not make till now independent. So now the question is, what strategy we can come out so that the other chunk of the class also be a part of such transaction. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So that's in fact the challenge that we have. That's why I mentioned it right at the beginning, and Dr. Padma Sarangapani also mentioned that in India there is this very significant context of inequality, and therefore while certain children have family circumstances where they can use this time to think creatively, critically, and develop other capabilities, not all children have that. So what other strategies can we develop? So when the possibility of physical interaction is not there, so this is where we need to come up with other ideas. So even in IIT, we find that students have come from many different backgrounds. Some of them don't have access to internet. So we create a lot of content and put it out there and then inform the students so that as per their convenience, as per their availability of technology, maybe they all have different kinds of access. They can get access to some of these learning activities, some of these group activities. So we also design different kinds of assignments, different kinds of projects, different kinds of group activities. So if face-to-face education is not possible, let us create other mechanisms and modes and make it available to the children so that they can also avail of these. Of course, where some mobility or movement is possible now after the lifting of the lockdown, we can also facilitate small groups of children to come together and carry out different kinds of activities, or maybe allotting specific teachers to these students, contacting them by phone or through other mechanisms to involve them in various kinds of activities. So we need to think of various other means and mechanisms to involve children who don't have the access to the regular kind of online facilities.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Good morning, sir. I am Jaideep from Ahmedabad. It was a very nice presentation, and it's music to our ear that the importance of the school is being, once again reiterated after this COVID-19 pandemic, and we are talking about physical space. But also, sir, side by side, being, in the field of education, we know that there is a huge condemnation of the school system as such because of its, tight and rigid system and the legacy of that industrial era. Yeah. So there is a huge, there is a long movement. Now people are talking about homeschooling and creating a physical space. We have enough opportunity in playground, in other assembly areas. So there is another trend that is going on, which is talking of not only reforming education, they are transforming altogether the school system. So a little bit on that also we would like to listen.
Okay. Yeah, so this is something, in fact, we had a discussion on this in our physical, in the talk that I gave in March also in Bandung. So there is this kind of alternate movement, alternate kind of education, which is as yet restricted to a very small section of the population. So, especially for a society in a particular stage of development like we are in India, it's very important that the physical and social space of a school is important because it provides access to a lot of facilities, including food for millions of children. So this physical space, the social opportunities, the access to libraries, to playgrounds, to friends, to teachers with whom one could discuss, this is a huge thing for millions of children. Okay, so majority of the people in India are low middle class or poor, and therefore that's the reason I shared 3 articles with Ms. Radha Subramaniam. One of them was actually from the American context and the other from the Indian context, and both of them talk about this, what you mentioned about the condemnation of the school system, how it is bad and so on. So there are two responses to this. One is to say that we cannot focus purely on quality. We have to think of quality in a complex way about what we children are actually acquiring in schools. It's not simply in terms of assessment and what kind of marks they get. There are a whole lot of other things that happen in schools which children acquire, which is equally important. So from that perspective, schools are definitely necessary, and the homeschooling and these are only for certain sections of the population. What was the second point I was thinking of? So the question, sorry, I lost track for a moment. So your question was about condemnation. Yeah, right. So the second point is that what is being stressed in both of these articles, one in the US and one in India, is that the teachers must involve in more deliberation and have more autonomy to address this issue of why there is so much of criticism against schools. So there is too much pressure from governments, from authorities, from school boards that this is what has to be covered, whereas the teacher is trained to think of education in terms of the purpose of education. They're not allowed to fulfill that. And to some extent, KV school has been successful because they have a little bit more autonomy than, for example, the state board schools. So it is this autonomy that we must fight for as schools, so that we can decide based on an understanding of children's needs what kind of best mechanisms can help us to achieve better results. It cannot come only through money or infrastructure or by imposing things from above. It has to come from us, from us teachers.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions? So if there are no other questions, I think I can take this opportunity to convey our thanks to Professor D. Parthsarthy for this insightful session. Starting with a brief but near complete review of the purpose of schooling in the physical context, he then explored to find the answer to the question, how to replicate the physical space in the online space. And in this, he had in the last slide listed out the attributes of the physical space and then how they can be extended to the online space. And here he has thrown open a big list of possibilities for the schools. Now it's for us, the leaders at the regional level, the leaders at the school level, and the leaders of the classroom, the teachers. Now they need to explore the options, they need to explore the possibilities in the context of the given constraints. You see, the classes are necessarily heterogeneous in nature. So some students have got a better access, some students don't have that kind of a better access. So keeping all these in view, we need to work out how best we utilize this time and then support the students. And the most important message Dr. Parthsarthy has shared in this session is beyond the knowledge and content part, the socialization part needs to be paid attention to, because the children have been physically forced to stay alone. They don't even get the opportunity to interact among themselves in the community, not even the school, not even in the community. And therefore, this aspect also needs to be taken into account. And sir, for your suggestion about what needs to be included for the assessment and then how best we can reduce the load on the children, we have taken note of your concept that's being followed in your systems, extra classes without marks. I will definitely take it up with my authorities in headquarters and see whether we can work out with some possible solutions in the near term. Thank you, sir. On behalf of Kendra Vidyalaya Sangathan and on behalf of my own fellow colleagues and my own self, I extend a hearty thanks to you, sir, once again. Thank you. Friends.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
This is the penultimate session. Day after tomorrow, we have the last session of this series by Professor B.N. Jagtap. Be ready to listen to that too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.